The afternoon sun filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Henderson family estate in Greenwich, Connecticut. Margaret Henderson stood in the kitchen, her hands trembling slightly as she prepared lunch for her son Daniel and his father, Richard. At 52 years old, Margaret carried extra weight that had accumulated over 20 years of marriage, depression, and countless nights of emotional eating while her husband worked late at his law firm. Daniel was home from Yale for spring break. At 23, he had inherited his father's sharp features and athletic build, along with something far more troubling, his father's casual cruelty disguised as concern. Margaret had always known she wasn't the wife Richard had envisioned keeping. She had been beautiful once, slim and vibrant when they met at a charity gala in Manhattan. But 3 miscarriages, years of fertility treatments, and the emotional toll of living with a man who measured her worth by her appearance had transformed her body and dimmed her spirit. She heard their voices drifting from the study. The door was slightly ajar. Richard's voice carried that dismissive tone she knew too well. "Where are you planning to take Jessica this weekend?" Jessica Hartwell was Daniel's girlfriend, a petite brunette from a prominent Boston family. Margaret had met her twice, both times feeling the young woman's eyes sweep over her with barely concealed disdain. Daniel's response made Margaret freeze, the knife in her hand hovering over the tomatoes she was slicing. "Probably the boathouse in Central Park." "But Dad, I need to ask you something." "It's kind of embarrassing." Margaret shouldn't have been listening. She knew that. But something in Daniel's tone made her feet root to the floor. "What is it?" Richard asked. "It's Mom." Daniel's voice dropped, but the acoustics of the old house carried his words perfectly. "Jessica keeps making comments. Last week when you guys came to New Haven for Parents' Weekend, her sorority sisters saw us all at dinner. Later, Jessica told me her friends were asking questions." "What kind of questions?" "About Mom's weight." Daniel cleared his throat. "Look, I know it sounds shallow, but Jessica comes from a family that really values appearance and health. Her mother does Pilates every morning and her father runs marathons. They're flying in next month for my graduation, and Jessica's already stressing about the photos." Margaret's hand went to her mouth. The knife clattered onto the cutting board. "What exactly are you saying, Daniel?" Richard's voice had that dangerous calm he used in depositions. "I'm saying I'm ashamed to be seen with someone so fat." Daniel said it plainly, without emotion, as if he were commenting on the weather. "Jessica's planning this whole graduation weekend, and she's already talking about professional photographers. I don't want Mom in those pictures, Dad. I'm sorry, but I don't. Every time we're out in public together, I can feel people staring. At Jessica's sorority formal last month, I made an excuse about Mom being sick so she wouldn't come." The silence that followed was suffocating. "Have you told your mother any of this?" Richard asked finally. "God, no. She'd fall apart. You know how emotional she gets. But I figured you could talk to her. Maybe suggest she skip graduation? You could say you have a big case or something. Jessica's family is already judgmental enough without Mom giving them ammunition." Margaret backed away from the door, her heart pounding so violently she thought it might burst through her chest. 23 years. She had carried him, raised him, sacrificed everything for him. The miscarriages had destroyed her body, but she had finally had Daniel, her miracle baby. Every soccer game, every parent-teacher conference, every late night when he was sick, she had been there. And this was how he saw her. As an embarrassment. As something to hide. She walked mechanically to her bedroom, pulled out her phone, and opened the recording app. Her hands were surprisingly steady as she walked back downstairs. The study door was still ajar. She positioned herself in the hallway and pressed record. "Maybe we could suggest she go to that spa in Arizona she's always talking about," Daniel continued. "You know, frame it as a gift. Get her out of town for a few weeks. By the time she's back, graduation will be over." That's incredibly hurtful, son. But Richard's tone carried no real rebuke. Your mother has struggled with her weight since the pregnancies. She's sensitive about it. I know, Dad. I'm not trying to be cruel. But I have to think about my future. Jessica's father has already offered me a position at his investment firm after I finished business school. This relationship matters. And honestly, when I think about introducing my girlfriend's family to Mom, I just feel this wave of embarrassment. She's not like Jessica's mom, who does charity luncheons and sits on museum boards. Mom just stays home and cooks. Margaret stopped the recording. She had heard enough. She walked back to the kitchen, put her phone in her purse, and continued preparing lunch with mechanical precision. When she called them to the table 20 minutes later, her voice was perfectly controlled. Richard and Daniel came in, talking about Daniel's summer internship plans. Neither of them looked at her with anything resembling guilt. Why would they? They had no idea she had heard. Margaret set the plates down, watched them eat the food she had prepared, and made a decision that would change everything. That night, Margaret lay awake in the guest bedroom where she had been sleeping for the past 3 years. Richard had suggested the arrangement, claiming his snoring kept her up. She knew the truth, he couldn't bear to look at her body anymore. She played the recording over and over, each word cutting deeper than the last. I'm ashamed to be seen with someone so fat. The voice was Daniel's, but the sentiment could have been Richard's. She had heard variations of it for years, hidden behind concern for her health, suggestions about new diets, comments about how she used to look. The next morning, Margaret did something she hadn't done in months. She got dressed, applied makeup, and drove to downtown Greenwich. She parked outside Russo and Associates, the law firm where an old friend from college worked. Linda Russo looked exactly as Margaret remembered, sharp-eyed, impeccably dressed, with silver hair cut in a precise bob. They had been roommates at Boston University, before Margaret met Richard, before she became the woman who disappeared into her marriage. Margaret, Linda said, standing from behind her desk. My God, how long has it been? Too long. Margaret sat down, her purse clutched in her lap. I need a divorce attorney, Linda. And I need to know what I'm entitled to. Linda's expression shifted to professional concern. Tell me everything. Margaret played the recording. Linda listened without interruption, her jaw tightening with each passing second. When it finished, Linda leaned back in her chair. How long have you been married? 23 years. This June. Do you have your own income? No. I stopped working when I got pregnant. Richard insisted. Linda pulled out a legal pad. Connecticut is an equitable distribution state. Given the length of your marriage and the fact that you have no independent income, you're looking at a substantial settlement. The Greenwich house alone is worth what, $4 million? Closer to 5, Margaret said quietly. Linda wrote quickly. And his partnership at the firm? I assume he's pulling 7 figures annually? Margaret nodded. Then we're talking about alimony, potentially for life given the circumstances. Half the marital assets. And Margaret, Linda looked up, her eyes fierce, that recording is psychological abuse. Your own son saying those things, your husband enabling it. We can use this. For the first time in years, Margaret felt something shift inside her chest. Not quite hope, but something close to it. Anger, maybe. Or the beginning of self-respect. I don't want to tell them yet, Margaret said. I need time to prepare. To get my documentation together. Smart. Linda handed her a folder. Start gathering financial records. Bank statements, tax returns, investment accounts. Do it quietly. And Margaret? Don't lose that recording. It's the most powerful piece of evidence you have. Margaret drove home with the folder hidden in her trunk. Richard and Daniel were in the study again, laughing about something. She walked past without stopping, climbed the stairs to her bedroom, and locked the door. She pulled out her laptop and began searching. Bank accounts. Investment portfolios. Property deeds. Her husband had always handled the finances, dismissing her questions with patronizing patience. Not anymore. Over the next 2 weeks, Margaret became a ghost in her own home. She moved through the rooms silently, preparing meals, doing laundry, maintaining the facade of normalcy while systematically documenting 23 years of financial information. What she discovered made her blood run cold. Richard had been hiding money. An offshore account in the Cayman Islands. A second property in Miami registered under his mother's name. Investment accounts she had never known existed. He had been preparing for something, maybe not a divorce, but certainly protecting assets she was legally entitled to half of. She photographed everything with her phone, uploading the images to a secure cloud account Linda had set up for her. Bank statements going back 15 years. Email exchanges with his financial advisor discussing asset protection strategies. Text messages with Daniel about trust funds and inheritance planning that deliberately excluded her. The betrayal went deeper than words spoken in a study. It was systematic, calculated, years in the making. On a Thursday morning, Margaret was in the kitchen when Jessica arrived unannounced. The young woman swept in wearing designer yoga clothes, her perfectly highlighted hair pulled into a high ponytail. "Mrs. Henderson," Jessica said with that bright, fake smile. "Is Daniel here?" "He's upstairs," Margaret replied, her voice neutral. Jessica glanced at the cookies Margaret was baking. "Oh, those smell amazing. I wish I could eat carbs like that." She laughed, the sound like breaking glass. "But you know how it is, got to maintain the figure." The cruelty was casual, almost unconscious. Jessica probably didn't even realize she was being insulting. Or maybe she did, and simply didn't care. Margaret smiled. "Actually, Jessica, I've been meaning to ask you something. What do you see in my son?" Jessica blinked, caught off guard. "What do I see in him?" "Yes. What attracted you to Daniel?" "Well, he's ambitious. Comes from a good family. Has great prospects." Jessica's smile widened. "And he's gorgeous, obviously." Not once did she mention kindness. Or compassion. Or character. "That tells me everything I need to know," Margaret said quietly. Before Jessica could respond, Daniel came bounding down the stairs. He kissed his girlfriend, then glanced at his mother with barely concealed impatience. "Mom, we're going out. Don't wait up." They left without a backward glance. Margaret stood in her kitchen, surrounded by the cookies she had baked out of habit, not love. She pulled out her phone and texted Linda, "I'm ready. File the papers." The response came immediately, Monday morning. "We strike first." Margaret allowed herself a small smile. If you're watching this story and rooting for someone to finally stand up for themselves, take a moment and subscribe to the channel. Because what happens next is going to change everything, and trust me, you won't want to miss the moment this family realizes exactly who they've been taking for granted. Monday morning arrived with unexpected sunshine. Margaret woke at 6, showered, and dressed in a navy blue suit she had bought specifically for this day. When she looked in the mirror, she saw someone different. Not thinner, not younger, but stronger. Present. Richard was already at the breakfast table reading the Wall Street Journal when she came downstairs. Daniel was still asleep, his graduation 3 weeks away. "I need to talk to you," Margaret said. Richard barely looked up. "Can it wait? I have a partners meeting at 9. "No. It can't." Something in her voice made him lower the newspaper. His eyes narrowed as he took in her appearance, the suit, the determined expression. Margaret placed a manila folder on the table in front of him. "What's this?" he asked. "Divorce papers. I'm filing today." The newspaper slipped from his hands. You're what? I heard everything. Margaret's voice was steady, each word deliberate. 2 weeks ago. You and Daniel. In the study. How he's ashamed of me. How you both wanted me gone for graduation. How I'm not good enough for Jessica's family, not good enough to be in photographs, not good enough to exist in my own son's life. Richard's face went pale. Margaret, I can explain. She held up her hand. I also found the offshore accounts, Richard. The Miami property. The asset protection strategies you've been implementing for the past 5 years. Did you think I was too stupid to find them? Too defeated to even look? His mouth opened, but no words came out. My attorney has copies of everything. The recording of Daniel's conversation. Every financial document you tried to hide. And Connecticut law is very clear about equitable distribution, especially when one party has been actively concealing assets. Richard stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. You can't do this. Think about Daniel. His graduation is in 3 weeks. I've thought about Daniel every day of his life. Margaret felt tears burning behind her eyes, but refused to let them fall. I destroyed my body bringing him into this world. I sacrificed my career, my identity, everything I was, to raise him. And he repays me by being ashamed I exist. You both taught him that loving someone is conditional on how they look, on whether they embarrass you in public. Margaret, please. Richard's voice cracked. We can work this out. I'll talk to Daniel. We'll go to counseling. It's too late for that. The papers will be served this afternoon. I'm moving out today. Linda has already arranged temporary housing. Where are you going? That's no longer your concern. Margaret picked up her purse and walked toward the door. Behind her, she heard Richard calling her name, his voice desperate now, but she didn't turn around. In the driveway, Linda was waiting in her car. Margaret climbed into the passenger seat, her hands shaking now that the confrontation was over. How do you feel? Linda asked. Margaret thought about it. Free, she said finally. For the first time in 20 years, I feel free. The divorce proceedings moved faster than Richard expected. He had underestimated Margaret, assumed her years of silence meant permanent defeat. He hired the best divorce attorney in Connecticut, but it didn't matter. The evidence was overwhelming. The recording of Daniel's words played in the attorney's office during mediation. Richard sat stone-faced while his lawyer shifted uncomfortably. Margaret watched her husband hear their son's cruelty replayed, watched him realize there was no defense, no explanation that would make this acceptable. The offshore accounts were the final blow. Richard's attorney tried to argue they were legitimate tax strategies, but Linda demolished that argument with emails showing clear intent to hide assets from Margaret. The judge was not impressed. 3 months after Margaret filed, the settlement was finalized. She received the Greenwich house, half of Richard's partnership value, lifetime alimony, and a substantial cash settlement. The Miami property would be sold and divided. Richard's reputation at the firm took a serious hit when word spread about the hidden assets. But the real reckoning came at Daniel's graduation. Margaret attended, despite everything. She wore an elegant emerald dress that Linda had helped her choose, her hair professionally styled. She sat in the family section alone, 3 rows behind Richard and Jessica's family. Daniel saw her as he walked across the stage to receive his diploma. Their eyes met for just a moment. Margaret saw the flash of shame cross his face, the recognition that his mother had not disappeared as he had wanted. She had simply stopped making herself small for his comfort. After the ceremony, Daniel approached her in the parking lot. Jessica hung back, uncertain. Mom, he started, his voice tight. I didn't think you'd come. You didn't want me to come, Margaret corrected gently. There's a difference. I heard about the divorce. About everything. Daniel looked down at his shoes, the same way he had as a little boy when he was caught in a lie. Dad told me you recorded us. I did. That was a private conversation. Margaret felt a surge of anger so pure it surprised her. You discussed erasing me from your graduation, from your life, because you were embarrassed by how I look. You called me fat. You said you were ashamed of me. And you're upset about privacy? Daniel's jaw clenched. I was just venting to Dad. Everyone complains about their parents sometimes. There's a difference between complaining and cruelty, Daniel. I gave you everything. My body, my career, my entire identity. And you reduced me to an embarrassment, something to hide from your girlfriend's family. I'm sorry, he said, but the words were hollow. No, you're not. Not yet. Margaret picked up her purse. Maybe someday you will be. When you have children of your own, when you love someone unconditionally and discover that love isn't returned. Maybe then you'll understand what you did. She walked to her car, leaving Daniel standing in the parking lot. In her rearview mirror, she saw Jessica approach him, her expression annoyed. Margaret didn't need to hear the conversation to know Jessica was upset about the drama, about Margaret's presence ruining her perfect graduation day. Margaret drove away and didn't look back. 2 years later, Margaret stood in the art gallery in Soho, New York City, surrounded by her photographs. The exhibition was called Invisible Women, a collection of portraits and stories from women who had been dismissed, diminished, or erased by the people who claimed to love them. Her own story was there too, displayed on a large panel with the audio recording available through headphones. Visitors would stand, listening to Daniel's words, reading Margaret's journey, and many left with tears in their eyes. Linda stood beside her, sipping champagne. You did it, she said quietly. You turned your pain into something powerful. Margaret had spent the first year after the divorce in therapy, working through decades of emotional abuse she hadn't even recognized as abuse. She had joined a support group for divorced women. She had started taking photography classes at the School of Visual Arts, rediscovering a passion she had abandoned when she married Richard. The weight was still there. She had lost some, gained some back, and eventually made peace with the fact that her body was not the problem. The problem had been people who measured her worth by her appearance, who made her believe she deserved less love because she occupied more space. Excuse me, a voice said behind her. Margaret turned to find a young woman, perhaps 25, holding a tissue. Your story, the woman said, her voice breaking. I needed to hear it. My boyfriend has been making comments about my weight. Little things, you know? Suggestions about the gym, jokes about what I eat. I kept telling myself he was just concerned about my health. Margaret took the woman's hand. It's never just concern. If someone loves you, they love all of you. Your body is not a problem to be solved. The woman nodded, wiping her eyes. Thank you. Thank you for being brave enough to share this. After she walked away, Margaret felt her phone vibrate. A text from an unknown number. Mom, it's Daniel. I'm in the city for work. Can we talk? Margaret stared at the message for a long moment. She had not spoken to her son since graduation day. He had sent a few emails in the first months, mostly about logistics and money, never about what had actually happened. She typed back, I'm at a gallery opening in Soho. Caldwell Gallery on Spring Street. If you want to talk, come here. 20 minutes later, Daniel walked in. He had aged in 2 years, his face thinner, harder. He looked around at the photographs, at the stories of women reclaiming their lives, and then he saw the panel with his own words displayed. Margaret watched him read it. Watched him put on the headphones and listen to his own voice saying I'm ashamed to be seen with someone so fat. Watched his face crumble as he realized this wasn't a private shame anymore. It was public. It was art. It was her truth. When he finally approached her, his eyes were red. Mom, he whispered. I'm so sorry. I'm so incredibly sorry. Margaret looked at her son, this man she had raised, and felt something shift in her chest. Not forgiveness, not yet. But maybe, eventually, the possibility of it. I know, she said quietly. Jessica and I broke up, Daniel continued. 6 months ago. She cheated on me with her father's business partner. When I was hurt, when I needed support, I realized I had no one. Because I had learned from Dad how to value people for what they could do for me, not for who they were. Margaret nodded slowly. I want to do better, Daniel said. I want to be better. Can I try?